Well, great. Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to today's Sprintax Non-Resident Tax Webinar for Bowling Green State University's international students and scholars. My name is Anna Fitzpatrick, and I am from the Sprintax team. And today we're hoping to make sure that everyone is all set for the tax filing season ahead and is aware of their tax filing obligations that you may have as an international student. Before we kick off, some general housekeeping. A recording will be made available to all attendees, so don't worry about having to take any notes or anything like that. You will be able to catch up and watch this back again. We would generally ask if everyone could mute during the presentation just to help to deal with any background noise, but we do welcome any questions throughout the session, so please feel free to use the chat and post in any questions, and we'll do a Q&A at the end of the session. Also, because it is tax that we're talking about, we do generally have to start off with this disclaimer. And this presentation is aiming to give everyone a general understanding of non-resident tax as it applies to international students and scholars studying at Bowling Green. So, this presentation is general, and we would say here at Sprintax that tax is a little bit like your DNA. So although you may seem nearly identical on paper to your fellow international students and scholars, one minor detail could make you be treated completely differently for tax purposes. So that's important to keep in mind, and make sure that you are looking at your own individual tax position when you're sitting down to prepare your non-resident tax returns. Looking at what we'll cover in today's session, we'll look at an overview of tax for non-resident students and scholars, looking at some key and core non-resident tax principles. We'll look at one of the tax season hot topics, understanding the implications of filing an incorrect tax return. So really here we're looking at the stimulus check, the implications of receiving the stimulus check in error, and eligibility for the check as well. We'll also look at a Sprintax process overview. So many of you may have received communication yesterday with information on Sprintax and your Sprintax access code. So we'll go through a process overview later in the session. And as I mentioned, questions and discussion always welcomed in the chat, so please feel free to avail of that. Looking in detail at some topics we'll cover residency for tax purposes, who needs to file for 2020, what are some of the forms you might receive, other things like FICA and state tax returns, for example. But when we're looking at the 2020 tax filing season, generally a good place to start is the important dates for 2020. So it may seem funny talking about the 2020 tax filing season when we are now in 2021. But the 2020 tax filing season is looking back on the 2020 tax year, and it's looking at the period of January 1st to December 31st, 2020. So we're looking back on that period, we're looking at any income you earned, any taxes that were withheld on that income, and we're looking to see if you might have maybe overpaid or perhaps underpaid tax to the IRS or to the state tax authorities. The really important date for the tax filing season is the tax filing deadline, which as it stands is Thursday, April 15th, 2021. So many of you may be familiar that last tax season we had an extension due to the pandemic to July 15th, 2020. As of right now, there's no indication that will be extended for the 2020 tax filing season, but we'll keep you up to date on any further releases on the deadline. But as it stands, it's Thursday, April 15th, 2021. A topic that can definitely tend to confuse a lot of international students and scholars is residency for tax purposes. So I'll break it down a little bit for everyone now. And the first important thing to mention here is that residency for tax purposes is independent of your visa or immigration status. So generally, most international students and scholars who are on F, J, M or Q visas are considered non-residents for tax purposes. If you're an international student on a J1 or an F1 visa, you'll automatically be considered a non-resident for your first 5 calendar years in the US. So you'll see it mentions a calendar year here. So if, for example, Anna entered into the US on December 31st, 2020, but her semester at Bowling Green didn't kick off until February of 2021. The IRS would count 2020 as Anna's first calendar year of presence in the US because she was actually present on US soil. Then if we're looking at scholars and researchers and their dependents on J visas, they're automatically considered non-residents for 2 out of the last 6 calendar years in the US. After those 6 calendar years, the clocks would reset and you would get another 2 years of non-resident status. But if you've been in the US for longer than that 5-year period, if you are an international student on a J1 or an F1 visa, or that 2-year period if you are a J researcher or scholar, then the IRS will need to use what is called the substantial presence test to determine your tax residency. And essentially, this test is looking back on the previous 3 years, and it's looking at your days of presence to determine your residency for tax purposes. The good news here is that Sprintax can do the thinking here for you. So the Sprintax system on step 1 will ask you to complete the residency step. We'll use the information you provide to us to determine whether you are a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes. Also, we will have a couple of COVID impacts throughout today's session, and one when we're looking at residency for tax purposes is that some international students and scholars may have left the US during the 2020 tax year as a result of the pandemic, and those days outside the US won't be counted towards the substantial presence test as you're not actually present on US soil. But we also have a useful residency summary slide here, which has a breakdown of some of the popular visa types, combined with the number of years that you would be exempt from the substantial presence test, so the number of years of non-resident status that you would have, and also information on FICA exemption, which I'll go through in more detail later in the session. But a really important topic that we need to look at is who needs to file for the 2020 tax filing season. And an important thing to mention here is that everyone needs to do something, and every non-resident has some type of IRS tax filing obligation. At the minimum, it is Form 8843, and this needs to be completed even if you haven't earned any income during the tax year. So I'll look at that in more detail in the next slide. But in many cases, you may have been in receipt of taxable US sourced income during the tax year. So you may have received some type of taxable scholarship. You may have received wages for on-campus employment, for example. And generally, as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, now if you earn anything over $0 and that's US sourced income, that's generally going to be taxable and will trigger a federal filing requirement, which is Form 1040 NOR. Another important thing to mention for this tax season is that the 1040 NOR EZ has been discontinued for the 2020 tax filing season. But looking in more detail at Form 8843 and what exactly is Form 8843. So as I've mentioned, it is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US. And essentially it confirms your non-resident status to the IRS. So it's like a declaration of your non-resident status. So it will need to be completed for each year that you are present on US soil as a non-resident for tax purposes. It's a part of your tax record, so please do make sure that you are preparing and filing Form 8843 for each year that you are a non-resident for tax purposes. And the good news again is that Sprintax can prepare and populate this form for you. But looking at some types of US income that may trigger filing requirements for non-residents in the US. So some of the most common may be employment income, so wages or compensation, for example. You may have received a taxable scholarship covering expenses such as room and board or a stipend or travel, for example. Or you may have received investment income. You may have invested on stocks and made a gain, for example. and generally all of that income would be deemed taxable and reportable on your tax return. We also have some other income, which may be less popular as an income source, but all the same, it would still trigger a filing requirement. So some examples, a focus group and you received a gift card, for example, or if you sold art or design works, for example, that's typically all taxable and reportable on your tax return. So the point here is really to look at all of the sources of income that you had during the tax year and your filing requirements as a result of receiving that income. But a really common question that we'd get from a lot of our international students and scholars is what income does not trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US? So we've some of the popular examples listed here. The first is scholarship for tuition and tuition-related expenses. So if you've received a scholarship for just tuition or tuition-related expenses, that's generally non-taxable, non-reportable on your return. But if you've received a scholarship that covers other expenses like room and board or housing allowance, for example, typically that would be deemed taxable and reportable on your tax return. Next up, we have scholarship received from outside the US. So if you've received, for example, a scholarship to study in the US from outside the US, so if, for example, Anna received a scholarship from Trinity College in Dublin in Ireland to study in the US, that generally won't trigger a filing requirement for Anna in the US. Next example is money transferred from parents and relatives overseas. So if you've received money from a parent or a relative to assist you with the cost of living when you're in the US, generally when that's coming from overseas, that won't be US sourced income, so shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US. The next example is similar income earned in your home country. So if, for example, you're still receiving wages from a job that you had in your home country, or perhaps you're receiving rental income from a property that you had in your home country. That would be similar to the previous example in that generally that wouldn't be US sourced income and shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US. Next example also shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents is interest on regular savings account. This is another very important slide on some of the tax documents that you might receive as a non-resident that you'll need when you're preparing your tax returns. We have the W-2, the 1042S and the 1099 series documents. The W-2 may be most common and would generally outline any wages, any salary, any compensation that you earned during the tax year, as well as the taxes that were withheld on that income. Generally, the deadline to receive a W-2 if you're due to receive one is January 31st, 2021. So many of you who are due a W-2 should have received it by now, and if not, it may be worth checking in with your employer to check on the status of that. Next up, and maybe second most common, would be the 1042S form. And this would typically outline any taxable scholarships, any stipends, royalty payments, prizes, any tax treaty exempt income, for example, would typically be outlined on a 1042S form. The deadline here is different. It's March 15th, 2021. So you may not have received your 1042S from Bowling Green just yet. So don't panic. The deadline is March 15th, 2021 to receive that, if you're due to receive one. Next up, and maybe less common for non-residents, but some non-residents may receive a 1099, is the 1099 series documents. This would typically outline any rental income, investment income, or commissions, for example, and the deadline to receive a 1099, if you're due to receive one, is by the end of March. So for anyone who may be waiting for their 1042S form, you will need this when you're preparing your tax returns. So make sure you do wait for that form if you are due one and use it on your tax return. A quick note on non-resident spouses and dependents. So we would get a lot of questions on whether non-resident spouses or non-resident dependents can file together. And unfortunately, there are no joint returns for non-residents in the US. Non-residents would need to file separately for tax purposes. And looking at the obligations, as we've mentioned, the minimum would be Form 8843. If you've received taxable US sourced income, you'll also need to file a federal tax return. And importantly, each dependent would need to mail their forms in separate envelopes. Where that changes is if a non-resident is married to a resident for tax purposes, you can elect to file jointly on your resident spouse's tax return. But we always would recommend doing the math on both options first to figure out which is the most favourable for your personal tax position. Moving on to FICA taxes, and FICA taxes may be less common for the likes of on-campus employment, but it can often pop up as an issue when individuals are taking part in off-campus employment, for example. And looking at exactly what FICA is, it's essentially a tax that is paid into that will assist you with the cost of healthcare when you're over the age of 65. In the eyes of the IRS, as a non-resident international student or scholar, you typically won't be here long enough to enjoy the benefits of that tax, and as a result, non-resident international students and scholars on J1 and F1 visas should not be paying FICA. It's not a blanket rule, so if individuals are on a H1B, a J2 or a TN visa, you would be subject to FICA from the first day of your employment. So if you've received a W-2, we'd recommend checking for Social Security and Medicare withheld. If you recognise that that's been withheld incorrectly and you're a non-resident international student or scholar and you shouldn't be paying FICA, there are opportunities to claim that back. So the first is to ask your employer for a FICA tax refund. If they refuse, you can apply for a FICA tax refund using Form 843 and Form 8316. So the first point of action is your employer, and it's only when they refuse can you apply using the forms listed. So the good news is that we can assist with those forms here at Sprintax as well. But we've gone through the federal side of things, and when we're looking at state taxes, state tax rules differ from state to state, as do state residency rules. Some states will only say you only need to file if you earn over $17,000, for example, whereas others will say you need to file from the very first dollar. It can also depend on other factors like your visa type or the number of days you've spent in the state, for example. Another one of our COVID impacts is if international students or scholars were studying in a state, for example, in Ohio, and they had to move as a result of the pandemic. Living and working in multiple states can trigger multiple state tax filing obligations. The good news here again is that Sprintax can do the thinking here for you. Sprintax can figure out whether you've triggered a state tax filing obligation and prepare your relevant state tax returns forms for you. But a quick note on who needs to file an Ohio state tax return. So looking at who needs to file, it would be every Ohio resident and every part-year resident. You'd be subject to Ohio income tax. And then every non-resident having Ohio sourced income also must file. There are a couple of exceptions. For example, a full-year non-resident living in Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Michigan, or Pennsylvania wouldn't need to file if the non-resident's only Ohio-sourced income is wages. So when we looked at residency for tax purposes at the beginning of today's session, that was on the federal tax side. When it comes to the state tax side, you could be a resident or a part-year resident or non-resident for state tax purposes. So the good thing, as I've mentioned here, is that Sprintax can figure this out for you, figure out whether you trigger the state tax filing obligation for Ohio or for other states, and prepare your relevant state tax return forms for you. Looking at the ITIN then, or the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. And when an individual is required to file a federal tax return, they will either need a social security number or they will need an ITIN. Where the ITIN is often required is if an individual has received taxable income during the tax year and needs to file a federal tax return, but they're not eligible to receive a social security number. So, for example, it can be pretty common in scholarship recipients such as athletes. For anyone who just needs to file Form 8843 and doesn't need to file a federal tax return, you won't need a social security number or an ITIN. Looking at the application process, it can be a little bit on the tricky side, but we'd always recommend filing early when it comes to ITIN applications. The ITIN application form is Form W7. It can be applied for in two ways. It can be applied for with the federal tax return, and in this case, your documents such as your visa or your passport would need to be certified by a certified acceptance agent, or it can be done at your local IRS office. The ITIN can also be applied for ahead of filing for your federal tax return. And in this case, your documents can be certified by a responsible officer at the school. We are seeing that there are significant delays in processing ITIN applications. So if you do need an ITIN, we'd recommend filing early where possible. Another very important slide on the 1098T, or the tuition statement. And the 1098T is a pretty common or significant cause of misfiling for non-residents. The 1098T is used by resident aliens to claim an educational tax credit on their resident tax return. Where we see misfiling is often some non-resident international students or scholars may file using a resident provider such as TurboTax, and they may use the 1098T to claim an educational tax credit. So when we're looking at that example, there's two important things to mention. The first is, as a non-resident alien for tax purposes, you won't be able to use a resident provider such as TurboTax to prepare your returns, because they would prepare a resident tax return for you. The second thing is that if you are a non-resident for tax purposes, you're not eligible to claim that educational tax credit. So if you are a non-resident and you've received a 1098T, we'd recommend keeping it for safekeeping, but you won't need it on Sprintax. Another tax season hot topic is definitely timelines for a refund. And this is becoming a question that we're getting asked a lot on different webinars, because there are significant delays from last tax season, from the 2019 tax filing season. On the federal side, we would have seen that federal refunds could take anywhere from between 6 weeks to 6 months. But as I mentioned, that's been significantly impacted from last tax season. The IRS are still working through a backlog from 2019. So if you're still waiting for a 2019 refund, don't worry, you're definitely not alone. And we'd recommend checking the status of your refund on the IRS website, irs.gov/refunds. On the state tax side, these will be similar, but will vary from state to state. But I suppose some good news on our side that I'll go through in more detail later in the session is that we are currently working on having e-filing for federal tax returns in place in the coming weeks. So that should hopefully quicken up and speed up the process in processing your 2020 tax returns. But there may be some individuals from Bowling Green on today's session who may have missed a year. So perhaps you're listening to today's session and you realise you've received taxable income in 2019 and you forgot to file, or maybe you filed incorrectly in the past. Maybe you filed as a resident by mistake and you're becoming aware of that. So firstly, don't panic, but do set the record straight. So when you may have forgotten to file for previous years, you can catch up and backfile at any stage, and we would recommend doing that as soon as possible. So the good news is that the IRS are happy to issue you your refund if you're due one in the previous 3 years. So there could be money waiting with the IRS in the form of a tax refund waiting to be issued to you. And the only opportunity to claim that is through filing your tax return. We can also assist with backfiling here at Sprintax. You can select the tax year you need assistance with on the tax year screen, and we can file your relevant tax forms. But there may be some, as I mentioned, some individuals who may have misfiled. So perhaps you may have filed as a resident in the past when you were a resident for tax purposes. Again, don't panic, but do set the record straight. So you'll need to file an amended tax return using Form 1040X and Form 1040 NOR. Again, we can certainly assist with amended tax returns and preparing your amended return here at Sprintax if you need some assistance. But another one of our tax season hot topics from last tax season and certainly coming into this tax season is the COVID economic impact payments. And we saw the stimulus check make the headlines across the US and across the world, with non-resident international students and scholars and professionals receiving the stimulus check in error. So in many cases, international students and scholars may have filed mistakenly in the past as a resident, and so in the eyes of the IRS, they were a resident for tax purposes, which resulted in them receiving the stimulus check in error. So this brought about a lot of questions on eligibility for the payment, and if you're not eligible, how to go about returning that. So when we're looking at eligibility for the economic impact payment, and when we're looking at international students and scholars, simply put, or in short, taxpayers won't qualify for the economic impact payment if you are a non-resident alien for tax purposes. Importantly, you'll also need to be a resident alien for 2020 in order to be eligible for the payment. So there may be some students at Bowling Green who may have been a resident alien in 2019, for example, but you may have left the US as a result of the pandemic in 2020, which may result in you returning to your non-resident alien status. So important, if you're a non-resident alien for 2020, you won't be eligible for the payment. We do have some useful blogs on the stimulus payment available on our Sprintax blog, which I'd be happy to share with everyone after the session. But we did see a second stimulus check come about around the end of December in 2020. And the eligibility here is very much the same. It's there for US citizens and resident aliens. So you won't qualify for the second check if you're a non-resident alien for 2020. But a very common scenario that we've seen as a result of non-resident international students and scholars receiving the stimulus check in error is that they became aware that they may have filed incorrectly in the past as a resident. So if that is the case for anyone on today's session, you'll need to file an amended tax return using Form 1040X and 1040 NOR for all incorrect years. You'll need to make any necessary amended return payment to the IRS. You'll need to return the stimulus payment to the IRS if you received it in error. So there's instructions on how to do so on the IRS website and also in those blog posts that I mentioned that I'll be sharing after. But another one of our COVID impacts is that you may have amended your tax return and returned the initial payment in 2020, but you may have actually received the second stimulus payment and you'll be required to return this too. So, when I was looking at the timelines for a refund and the delays in processing returns, this has also impacted the delays in processing amended tax returns. So we actually have results from a recent survey here at Sprintax, and we found that around 4 in 10 non-resident aliens who amended their tax return in 2020 returned the first payment, also received the second stimulus payment, and they'll be required to return that too. So just important to keep that in mind. The IRS likely may not have gotten around to processing your amended return, and if you've received the second check in error, you'll need to return that too. But looking at the reality of the situation here at Sprintax and looking at some interesting stats. In 2019, here at Sprintax, we prepared around 330 amended tax returns. We saw that jump to around 5,500 amended returns in 2020. So that was largely as a result of the stimulus check going to non-residents across the US and across the world. And when they became aware of any error, they were eager to fix that and make things right with the IRS. But a very important slide that we always have to cover is the implications of not filing. So we've some implications listed there, but one we have highlighted and that we always continue to emphasize is the impacts that not filing could have on your future immigration status. So there may be some individuals on today's session who may be looking to stay in the US. You may be looking to apply for a change of status, for example. You may be looking to apply for a H-1B or LPR, for example. And when you're applying for a change of status, it's very likely that you'll be asked for evidence of tax compliance. And we would hate to see tax being anything that would prevent anyone from staying in the US. So with that said, it's just really important that everyone is aware of their tax filing obligations and is being tax compliant. Other implications include fines and penalties, and interest can build up when the IRS are owed money. And you might actually be missing out on a tax refund. So we have some interesting refund stats that I'll show at the end of the session, but the only opportunity to reclaim overpaid tax is through filing your tax return. Just a quick note to be careful of the options that are being recommended to you. So you may have fellow international students or scholars or fellow resident alien students or scholars who may be residents for tax purposes, and they may be using resident providers such as TurboTax to prepare their tax returns. But if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes, you won't be able to use resident providers such as TurboTax to prepare your tax returns, because they would prepare a resident return for you. So just to be aware of that. But one of the last sections that we'll cover in today's session is a Sprintax process overview. So many of you may be familiar with Sprintax, and we assist with non-resident tax compliance and non-resident tax returns in the US. And I'm aware that you may have received communications yesterday with some information on your Sprintax access code for this tax season. This is certainly to your benefit, and it's a great resource to have in place and a great resource that Bowling Green have put in place for you. So please do ensure that you're looking at this communication and that you're availing of that. But you'll likely have a link to Sprintax that you can select. When you select the link, if you've used us for previous years, you can simply log in with your original credentials. If not, you can quickly and easily set up an account at this point. And the first step, and one of the most important steps you'll need to complete, is residency for tax purposes. So we need to figure out if you are a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes. At this point, we'll be asking you residency-related questions such as, were you present on US soil in 2020? What are your visits to the US, as well as your entry and exit dates and the visa types you held on those visits? And we'll use the information you provide to us to determine your residency for tax purposes. So if you are a resident for tax purposes, we will stop you at this point. We'll let you know that you're a resident for tax purposes, and we'll let you know that you can't continue to use Sprintax because we are a non-resident provider, but we will be able to point you in the direction of our resident partner TurboTax to prepare your resident return with them. So even our recommendation generally, if people are a little bit unsure on their residency, or you think you might be a resident alien, you think you might meet the substantial presence test this year, you can complete this step on Sprintax free of charge. You can simply enter your residency information, and we'll do the thinking there for you. So it's important to make sure that you're filing correctly, whether that's as a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes. We will also need to gather your income information. So some students from Bowling Green may have a W-2, some may have a 1042-S, a 1099, or you may have multiple income documents. You may have multiple W-2s, for example. And we will be asking you for your income information at the income detail stage. So an exciting update we have on our side for this tax season is OCR, or optical character recognition. And this will essentially allow you to take an image of your income document and upload it to the system so it will be populated on your behalf. So hopefully saving you a couple of minutes as you're moving through the system and preventing you from having to manually enter all of the individual fields from your income document. An important thing to mention on this screen too is that we do have 24/7 live chat during tax filing season. So if anyone has any queries on their non-resident tax position or on the system or anything like that, please feel free to avail of the live chat, who will be there around the clock, no matter what time you're filing at or where you're filing from, right up until the tax filing deadline. But we can also assist with state taxes. So the system can figure out whether you've triggered a state tax filing obligation from the information you provided to us. And if it thinks you've triggered a state tax filing obligation, it will start to ask some additional questions surrounding the state tax law in that state. And we can prepare your relevant state tax return forms for you. We can also figure out if you may have multiple state tax filing obligations and prepare the relevant forms. But you will also reach the order breakdown stage. So this will give you a summary of the services that have been provided. So in this case, we have a federal tax return, which would also prepare Form 8843 alongside that. We have a state tax return prepared for New York as well. And this is the section that you will enter your code from Bowling Green. So this is a section that you'll enter your code and click validate, and it will cover the cost of your federal tax return at this point. So again, just to mention that that's a super resource to have in place, so please do make sure that you are availing of that. Once we move through the order breakdown stage, we'll be able to generate your tax forms for you. So you can see here that this student has a federal return for 2020 prepared. They'd also have Form 8843 alongside that, and any other relevant forms that apply to them. So at present, we are live for paper federal returns on Sprintax, but we are currently in the process of working on having e-filing available for federal tax returns over the next week to 10 days. So that's something that we're super excited about, and we'll be communicating that with everyone as soon as that is available. But on the state tax return side, these will still need to be mailed, and as well, Form 8843 by itself will still need to be mailed, but we will provide detailed instructions on exactly what you need to do and how you need to go about filing your forms. So you can see here, if a student went through the system now and prepared a federal return, we'd give them a tax pack, which would have their instructions, including a section, how do I file my tax forms, and providing the instructions and the address to send the returns to. But for anyone or any students who may need to file an amended tax return, we can assist with that. You can select the option that you need to correct your tax return for the specific year, and we can bring you through an amended return questionnaire and prepare an amended return for you. But looking at some other support that we have in place, this is a great resource, these tax webinars. So it's certainly a great thing to have in place and make sure that you're all set for the tax filing season. We also have blog content for tax awareness. So I've mentioned our stimulus check blog a couple of times. We also have an interesting blog on investment income that's been posted recently. We're definitely seeing investment income popping up more and more among the international community. So there's lots of useful and interesting information on that. We have our YouTube channel, so lots of educational tax videos available on that. We also have 24/7 live chat during filing season, as I've mentioned. And something new and exciting is our SPRINTAXTDS personal system. And SPRINTAXTDS personal is essentially a system that is used to prepare your pre-OPT or CPT employment tax documents. So it's used to prepare any tax documents that you might need before employment to ensure that you're taxed correctly on your income from that employer. So TDS Personal will look at your residency determination, your tax treaty eligibility, whether you should be exempt from FICA or not, and that can be pretty useful because a lot of the time on off-campus employment, employers may be typically used to taxing resident aliens, and they may withhold FICA incorrectly, so it can be useful to let them know ahead of time not to withhold FICA if that's the situation. And we can also prepare those pre-employment forms, so the W4, for example, the W8 BEN, or the 8233. All you need to do is print them, sign them, and provide them to your employer. But it is very important to mention that this is separate to any end-of-year tax filing that you might need to do. So this is separate to the Sprintax tax preparation that we went through, that you have your access code for. Sprintax tax preparation is looking at your tax returns, whereas this is looking at any pre-employment forms that you might need to prepare. But you can quickly and easily set up an account with SPRINTAXTDS Personal, answer a questionnaire, and we can prepare any applicable forms for you. But before we finish up and address any questions that might have come through, we have some interesting stats from last tax season here at Sprintax. So from the 215,000 non-resident international students, scholars and professionals who use Sprintax to prepare their tax returns. So last tax season, we had around 325,000 registrations versus around 215,000 completions. So you can see that there's a natural drop off there between those who registered and intended to file versus those who actually completed the process and filed. So just a reminder to keep taxes in mind, and if you have tax filing obligations, to make sure that you follow the process through, complete it, and actually file your tax forms. But I mentioned the interesting refund statistics again from last tax season here at Sprintax. On the federal side, we would have seen that around 70% received an average refund of around $1,100. And on the state tax side, we saw around 59% received an average refund of around $460. So although tax compliance definitely remains as the most important element, and it's the element that we're constantly communicating with our international communities, it is nice to see that there are often monetary benefits to being tax compliant. And important to mention, whether you are due a tax refund will really depend on your personal tax position. But the Sprintax system will be able to figure that out for you and let you know whether you may be due a refund or whether you may actually owe tax. But that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them into the questions box. I'd be more than happy to address them now after the session.
Hi, Anna. Hi, Maid. Thanks for such a nice presentation. Actually, I have some questions.
Yeah.
My first question, in last year, I filled out all form online, but I didn't mail to any address.
Okay.
So am I eligible to do any amend my tax return?
So if you prepared your returns for 2019, you will need to mail them. So did you use Sprintax to prepare your returns?
I prepared my all documents. I filled out the form online via Sprintax website.
Yeah.
I successfully completed all steps, but I didn't mail it.
Okay, well you can access your 2019 returns on your Sprintax account now, and you will need to mail them. So you will need to download that pack and print them, sign them, and mail them. So if you owed any tax, there may be some type of penalty if that wasn't sorted out last season. but if you paid that, then you should be fine once you mail your forms.
Okay.
But you'll be able to download that pack from your 2019 account. So when you log in, you'll be able to click on 2019, and then you'll be able to click on your tax forms and to download them. And in that tax pack, there'll be that first screen saying, you know, this is what you need to do and how you need to file. So giving you the address to send them to, for example.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Also, do I need to fill out two separate forms for federal tax and state tax?
So yeah, the federal tax form would be the 1040 NOR. Whether you trigger a state tax filing obligation can be difficult to determine over the webinar, but that's where the system's logic is built to figure that out, and will prepare the relevant form for you. So if you've just been living and earning income in Ohio, the system can figure that out and prepare your relevant forms for you. So you know, you don't need to worry too much about the specific names of the forms, for example, because the system will figure out what's applicable to you and prepare them then.
So it includes both taxes for federal and state at the same time.
Exactly, yeah. So it's one questionnaire. The code will generally cover your federal return, but if you can do the whole process in one seamless process, and it's federal and state under the one roof. So if I go back to, I can show you the last screen. So you can see here, if you had a state tax return prepared for Ohio, that will be listed here on the screen in the order breakdown.
So which address do I need to mail that?
Yeah, so if I go to the next, so at the bottom, on this screenshot that is here on the tax pack, just on the lower part that's not included in this screenshot, there would be an option that says, how do I file my tax form? So this says, how do I make payment? There'll be an option, how do I file my tax forms? And that will have the address that you need to send it to, whether it's for federal or state. And there will be explicit instructions on that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any?
That's all.
Great. Well, we definitely recommend with the 2019 returns to mail them as soon as possible. And then if you have any issues accessing them or anything like that, I wouldn't imagine there should be, but if there is, feel free to let us know, and we can give you a hand.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, have a great day.
You too. And just on other support, I know I mentioned our live chat. We do have our email support, hello@sprintax.com. So for anyone who may be tuning into the session after, at a later date, there is lots of support there. So, you know, don't worry, you can reach out to our support team who'd be happy to assist.
Yeah, thank you.
Mighty, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I do not.
No.
Other than we do have a website that is all about taxes, just filing for taxes. So for students who are watching this later on, this webinar later on, please feel free to visit that website. And if you did not receive the email from our office, like Anna mentioned, please do contact us, contact our office at iss@bgsu.edu, and we'll be sure to get that email out to you right away. So thank you, Anna, for the webinar. We are hosting a second one. I don't know if you're mentioning that, Anna, in a little bit. Okay, but thank you again for your time.
Yeah, we're certainly hosting a second one. So, you know, it's great to have one webinar offered, but to have two is brilliant. And hopefully by the time the second webinar comes around, everyone may be starting the process, certainly may have received their 1042Ss and may actually be looking at filing. Now maybe slightly a preparation, but certainly I imagine we'll have more questions when everyone's actually in the middle of the process. But definitely looking forward to our second webinar, and if anything comes up after this session, feel free to let me know and I'd be happy to help.
Sounds good. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.